you may be doing a lot of things differently than your competitors do. And they may be having a hard time as a result figuring out which one or which ones of those things that you're doing differently is responsible for your superior performance. That's what we call causal ambiguity. Now, this is clearly in play, this causal ambiguity factor is clearly in play in the Southwest Airlines example. As Porter points out in the What is Strategy article, Southwest Airlines does a lot of things differently than the other major airlines do. They have a lot of different types of resources. You can see this in the activity systems diagram that Porter puts in that What is Strategy article. There's a lot of different ways that Southwest is divergent from the business model of the more typical hub and spoke airline. And so it might be quite difficult for a competitor to figure out which of those things that Southwest is doing differently is really responsible for their superior performance. And therefore, that's a barrier to diagnosis, which then becomes a barrier to imitation. Let's talk about what are the barriers to imitation at the resource acquisition stage. Well, here the primary focus is on the immobility of the resource. If the resource or capability in question is embedded in the firm's culture, systems, and processes, then it will be difficult for competitors to acquire that. It'll be difficult for them to hire it away, and it'll be difficult for them to recreate it on their own. On the other hand, if the resource or capability that you are depending upon for your competitive advantage is embedded in a single person or in a small group of people, then those are resources that can easily be hired away by a competitor. Those are mobile resources. People are relatively mobile resources. Cultures, systems, processes, those are much less mobile forms of resource. And so, to the extent that your competitive advantage depends upon those less mobile types of resources, it will be difficult for a competitor who's seeking to imitate your advantage to acquire those resources. And here again, I think the application to the Southwest Airlines example is very straightforward. Because as you can see, again, from that activity system diagram in the Porter What is Strategy article, Southwest's competitive advantage is not in just a few people. It's not in Herb Kelleher and his management team and those few people at the top. It's not in any few people anywhere in the company. Southwest's competitive advantage is embedded in the entire company's culture, systems, and processes and way of doing business. And so it would be very difficult to move that to a different company or to recreate that in a different company. Okay, finally, let's talk about the barriers to imitation at the deployment stage. Now here, and this is another point made by Porter in that What is Strategy article. Here the point is that if your competitive advantage depends not just on a single resource or a small number of resources, but on a complex combination of different resources and capabilities and activities that only work best when used together. And so the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If it's this complex combination of different resources and activities that only work well together, that don't work as well separately, and that contradict your competitors' prior commitments to other ways of doing things, then those other competitors are going to have a devil of a time trying to imitate what you're doing. Because not only do they have to, get one resource, imitated, they've got to get a whole complex of resources imitated. They've got to get them working together in the same way that you've got them working together. And they have to be working well within that competitor's system of other pre-existing resources. And if these resources that underlie the way you do business are different and contradictory to the resources that underlie their pre-existing way of doing business, they're going to have a devil of a time imitating that. And here again, the example of Southwest Airlines is brilliant. Porter mentions in the article, in that What is Strategy article, the effort that Continental Airlines made to imitate Southwest Airlines. Continental established a division called Continental Light. And their idea for Continental Light was to create a no-frills division of their airline that would try to compete in sort of a Southwest way. They eliminated a lot of the frills, but they could not imitate every piece of Southwest's strategy. They could only imitate a few isolated pieces of it. And so they were not successful. Continental Light was a miserable, miserable failure that lost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for Continental because they only imitated selected pieces of what Southwest was doing. They did not imitate the whole system. And moreover, the pieces that they imitated did not work well with the rest of Continental. See, Continental was trying to operate Continental Light as a no-frills, low-fare airline, and also simultaneously continue operating the main part of Continental as a full-service, high-frills, high-cost airline. And they found that the contradiction between those two ways of doing business was just enormous and caused huge problems for them. So, for example, one of the centerpieces and cornerstones of Southwest's business model and strategy is the way that Southwest uses only uncongested secondary airports and secondary cities, because that enables them to get the quick turnaround time that the efficiency of having high airplane utilization gives them their advantage, right? So they cannot, Southwest Airlines can't compete in heavily congested airports, and they don't try to. And that's part of the brilliance of their strategy, is that they don't try to. They know they can't compete in heavily congested airports of major cities. They only focus on, the smaller secondary airports where there's not the same sort of level of congestion. Continental couldn't do that when they were trying to imitate Southwest. They still were serving the same large city, heavily congested airports. And that meant that they could not get the quick turnaround time that Southwest was getting. And that quick turnaround time was the fundamental source of the low costs that Southwest had that enabled them to charge the lower prices. Since Continental couldn't imitate that, they were still stuck basically with high costs, even though they had cut out a lot of the frills, because they were still in these congested airports of the major cities. Also, another piece of what Southwest had done to keep its costs low is Southwest does not sell tickets through travel agents. They don't want to pay the travel agents the extra couple of bucks that they charge to sell tickets for them. And that's one way that Southwest saves money. Well, when Continental tried to do that, they found they had a lot of problems because they could not afford to compete on price and still pay the standard travel agent commissions, but they also couldn't do without travel agents for the full service business in the non-light part of Continental, in the main part of Continental, full service business. So what Continental do? What they did was disastrous. They tried to compromise between the Continental Light part of the business and the main full-service Continental part of the business by cutting commissions for travel agents across the board on all Continental flights, regardless of whether it was light or not. And that was a disaster because they ticked off the travel agents, and they also did not achieve the low costs that they needed to compete on the Continental Light side. Similarly, another thing that Southwest does to keep its costs low is they don't mess around with frequent flyer programs. Frequent flyer programs add to the cost of an airline. And so Southwest doesn't do it. This was a problem for Continental because Continental was pre-committed. Before they tried this Continental Light venture, they were pre-committed to having a frequent flyer program. They could not afford to offer the same frequent flyer benefits to travelers on the Continental Light part of Continental and still turn a profit. But nor could they eliminate the frequent flyer part from the frequent flyer features from the main part of Continental, the non-light part, without really ticking off their business travelers, their frequent travelers. So what did they do? Again, they had a disastrous compromise. Basically, Continental lowered the rewards of the entire frequent flyer program across both parts of the business, both the full service and the Continental Light part. And as a result, again, they ticked off their customers, they ticked off their travel agents, and it was a disastrous failure. So I think the Continental Light example of Continental trying to imitate Southwest is a great example of a barrier to imitation at this deployment phase, right? Because Continental had gotten through all four of the first four steps. They recognized Southwest had an advantage. They decided they had some incentive to try to imitate it. They diagnosed at least part of what Southwest was doing differently that was successful for them. They acquired some of the resources necessary to compete against Southwest in that same way. But it was only at this fifth and final phase, at the deployment phase, that Continental Light failed. And so I think the point here is that Southwest Airlines is just brilliantly protected against anybody imitating their strategy because they have erected barriers to imitation at all five phases of the imitation process. So nobody's going to imitate Southwest successfully because they can't get through all those barriers to imitation. Now let's take a look at the contrast between Southwest Airlines and the Xerox PARC example. Because whereas Southwest Airlines is protected from imitation at all five of these stages, Xerox PARC, I think, was protected from imitation at none of these stages. They had none of these barriers to imitation. It was only before the idea was made public, when they kept the technology a secret that was known only within the narrow confines of Xerox employees, the staff of PARC, only at that point was the resource non-imitable because nobody else knew about it, right? And so only at that stage were there impediments to recognition or diagnosis. But once the cat was out of the bag, once Xerox had let Steve Jobs and his team from Apple get a demonstration of the product, there were no more barriers to imitation. Anybody could imitate it, and especially Steve Jobs and the folks from Apple, because it became more public knowledge. And so those barriers to recognition and barriers to diagnosis fell. Certainly, Xerox did not apply any of these other barriers to imitation. They didn't deter anything. They didn't preempt anything. And certainly they couldn't immobilize the resource. As you could see from the fact that after Steve Jobs and his team got a demo of the Alto system at Xerox, they basically went in and systematically hired away a lot of the key employees from Xerox PARC. So there was nothing about the resource that was immobile at Xerox. It was not embedded in the culture or systems or processes, and the key people were happy to move to Apple for the right price. So all of these barriers to imitation that protect Southwest Airlines from imitation of competitors, none of them applied in the Xerox PARC case.